Basically, Gavin Newsom can do whatever he wants. And if he decides the Menendez brothers should be released, it could be immediately. Yesterday was a bombshell ruling in the Menendez case. Instead of serving life without the possibility of parole, the Menendez brothers are now eligible for parole after serving 50 years. But it doesn't stop there. Because they were under 26 at the time the crime was committed, they're eligible under the California Youth Offenders Act to immediately be reviewed by the parole board, which means they're parole eligible as of today. This is a step towards freedom for the Menendez brothers.
Talk to me about their statements from yesterday, the brothers' statements. The DA has been hanging his hat on the fact that they haven't taken accountability. And it seems like they started to do that yesterday. So how does that change this case moving forward?
The DA was so focused on the Menendez brothers' failure to take accountability for their crimes. But yesterday, they spoke in court and they said, there is no excuse for what we did. We killed our parents. There's no excuse for it. And that's one of the factors the judge looked at in making the determination that they're parole eligible. The entire time we've heard the Menendez brothers' side of the case, they've focused on past abuse as a reason for their crime. The argument was imperfect self-defense, and that was what was raised in courtrooms throughout the course of the years, including all of their appeals. But yesterday in the courtroom, they said there is no excuse for our actions. That's certainly something they could have discussed with their attorneys. How do they walk that fine line between preserving all of the appellate arguments that still exist in their habeas corpus petition, but also falling on the sword and taking accountability in the courtroom for the purposes of resentencing? It was definitely something discussed behind the scenes with the attorney and the client.
I want to talk a little bit about the headlines and if they're misleading. Some make it seem like yesterday's ruling will ensure the brothers' freedom. What is the truth there?
Certainly, yesterday's ruling was a positive for the Menendez brothers, but it does not ensure their freedom. In fact, the judge rejected the defense argument to downgrade their murder one conviction to manslaughter. Now, that would have meant immediate release because they already would have served the maximum sentence that manslaughter carries. The judge did not go that far. The judge said they should be released. It shouldn't be life without parole, but they're not ready yet, and essentially punted the issue to the parole board to make a determination about whether or not they will go free and when.
Hoffman argued that they are not a low risk and that they were actually ruled moderate risk. What exactly were the factors in that, and how could that impact the brothers moving forward in the next steps with the parole board?
Something that was surprising to everyone was the results of the parole board's risk assessment report. For the entirety of this case, we'd heard the defense say the Menendez brothers were model prisoners. They helped so many people behind bars. They truly were rehabilitated. But then the results of the risk assessment came out, and they were deemed a moderate risk. The reason? Because they didn't follow the rules behind bars. And if you don't follow the rules behind bars, it's unlikely you'll follow the rules when you're on the outside. So the parole board, in doing the risk assessment, identified issues such as illegal cell phones, drug use, and also helping other prisoners commit tax fraud. All of these factors went against the Menendez brothers in the resentencing hearing. They will also be factors in their upcoming parole hearing.
Explain their different avenues to freedom and how realistic is it, do you think, that they could be released at some point?
There's currently several different avenues to freedom. Of course, now we know the resentencing hearing, a positive result, they have the opportunity to seek parole. But that means the parole board now takes over the case. The parole board process is much different than the resentencing hearing. It's based on different factors. The factors the parole board will look at: the nature of the crime, behavior behind bars, whether or not they've been rehabilitated. But the primary focus is on whether they are a risk to society if they were to be released. Now, the parole board isn't just a judge, it's a panel of 3. And majority rules on that panel. So they have to convince through their lawyers, through witnesses who will be their family members who support their release, corrections officers, psychologists, all of these people will be involved in that proceeding. And they have to convince the parole board that they are not a risk if they were to be released. If the parole board were to deny their request at this upcoming hearing in June, they're still parole eligible, but they won't get a new hearing for 3, 5, 10, or 15 years. It's up to the parole board when they believe using resources behind bars to rehabilitate, they will be in a position to be eligible for parole again. So there's a lot involved in the process, and it doesn't come without risk. It's by no means a guarantee. Another avenue that the Menendez brothers have is clemency. They've sought that from the governor, and the governor has a lot of discretion whether or not to say they should be released, and that could be immediate. Now, the governor utilizes that risk assessment report that the parole board prepares, but he's not bound to it. Basically, Gavin Newsom can do whatever he wants, and if he decides the Menendez brothers should be released, it could be immediately. With clemency, the governor has so much discretion. And there's a couple of different ways clemency can be granted. One is to say that the charge is downgraded from murder 1 to manslaughter, which would require immediate release because they've already served their time. The other is to say they've simply served enough time, and at this point, they should be released. The governor doesn't have the same parameters that the parole board has for release. So it could be immediate if Governor Newsom were to step in. What's likely to happen is the governor will take a back seat, let the process play out. He said as much when the resentencing hearing was moving forward. He could have intervened then, but he said, I'm going to let the court system take control here. And I think you're going to see that with the parole board as well. He'll sit back, see how the parole board responds, and if they're denied parole, that's when he could potentially step in.
Could they be granted freedom on June 13th? And how long would it actually be before we see them outside of prison walls?
June 13th is the Menendez brothers' parole hearing. So there'll be witnesses who will testify. The defense will put on a case. Prosecutors can show up and say, we don't believe they should be released. So it's basically like a mini trial. Ultimately, the parole board will make a decision based on everything that comes into that proceeding, but primarily focused on the risk assessment report and that critical question, are the Menendez brothers a danger to society? If parole is granted, they're not released immediately. There has to be a plan in place for their post-incarceration. So all of that will happen behind the scenes, but they could be released as soon as this summer if the parole board agrees with the defense that they're rehabilitated and that they should be released as soon as possible. It's a panel of 3 parole board members. They don't have to decide that day. Most of the time, they would reserve decision, review the record, and then make a written recommendation for parole. So it's important to understand what freedom would mean. There has to be a post-incarceration plan, and there can be conditions attached to parole, meaning if the Menendez brothers were to commit a crime, even something minor, they could find themselves back behind bars. So all of that has to be in place before they're actually released. In addition to everything that we heard at the resentencing hearing, which is likely to be very similar at the parole board hearing, we only heard small excerpts of the risk assessment report because the judge only allowed certain components admissible in court. We might learn a lot more about why the determination was moderate risk during that parole board hearing. And in addition to all of the witness testimony, their supporters, we know their family members will likely say that they advocate for their release. They need to provide a plan, how they're going to integrate back into society. The parole board is going to look as to whether or not they have family support, whether they'll be employable, and all sorts of other factors that will help them integrate back in after serving over 30 years in prison. This is a very unique case, and we saw how unique at the resentencing hearing, which is something we'll also see at the upcoming parole hearing. The victims, the Menendez family members, Kitty and Jose's relatives, are also the staunch supporters of the Menendez brothers. So it's a very different dynamic when it comes down to the support and what you hear on the stand advocating for their release. It's an unusual situation where the victims are also the advocates.